Hello again, and welcome to And Did Those Feet, a podcast exploring and celebrating the golden age of English football, 25 years after the war, from 1946 to 1970. And joining me as ever, Karl Hensley. Hello, Karl.
Hello, Peter.
Talk about the 25 FA Cup finals that followed the war, from 1946 and victory for Derby, right through to Chelsea's win in 1970 in a replay. A game I remember distinctly. They were great occasions, weren't they? Almost national occasions. Let's recall some of the highlights. Which games stand out for you from this period?
Well, I've got to admit, the first one that jumps out to me is the 1948 final. My bias coming into play as a Manchester United supporter. But I think that was seen, even at the time, as being a particularly great match between two very, very entertaining sides. Then the 56 final with the Bert Trautmann incident with his breaking his neck, but also the tactics in that game, how Don Revie wasn't necessarily expected as a selection, but he did play, and tactically that one was very interesting.
Yeah, it was.
I think I would then go to the very last one of those finals, 19. Absolutely remarkable couple of games, but especially the replay, which was a thrilling match, and yet also it epitomizes the thuggery that sometimes was around in football in that era. The two extremely good sides, but they did kick each other off the pitch.
I think it's extraordinary how in that game nobody actually got sent off. I think that's right, isn't it? They all did survive right the way through to the end of the game.
No,
in fact, I don't think anyone in any of the 25 games we've got here was sent off. I think the first person to get sent off was it around about 76, Man United, Kevin Moran.
It was even later than that. It was 85. Ooh. Kevin Moran playing for United against Everton.
That's right. So that is remarkable that nobody, because Chelsea Leeds was a bloodbath. And I remember it distinctly because, well, as you say, there was the first game, and then one of the curious things about that game is the fact that in both matches, both the original match and the replay, the team Leeds took the lead in both games and were pegged back in both games, and of course in the second game pegged right back because they were 1-0 up and lost the game 2-1 to a terrific headed goal by Peter Osgood, and I remember it because I had a bet with an elderly lady who lived near to us, as I was about 12 at the time. I had a bet with her, and I remember it was 5 bob. It was a 5 bob bet that Chelsea would win, and I got my money, and I got it. I remember distinctly her passing me the money, 2 of those heavy old half crowns in the palm of my hand. So wow. That's amazing. That was an amazing game, and I think that the fact that Chelsea came back from behind on both occasions is a really interesting feature of the FA Cup finals we're talking about in general, because time and again, I say time and again, I'm exaggerating, quite often, surprisingly often, the team that scores the first goal doesn't go on to win the match. In fact, I think I've calculated that 6 out of the 25, 7 out of 26, if you count the 2 games in 1970, the team that scores the first goal doesn't go on to win the game. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying there's at least 2 of these games, 2 of these finals, teams go 2 goals ahead. So Bolton go 2 up against Blackpool in 1953. And Sheffield Wednesday go 2 up against Everton in 1966 and still lose. And I think that's one of the striking things about these games is that they're real ding-dong affairs. They're quite unpredictable. Taking the lead doesn't guarantee anything. Take for example, 54, when West Brom against Preston.
Yes.
West Brom take the lead, 1-0 to West Brom. Preston equalise, 1-1. Preston then take the lead. Preston 2, West Brom 1. West Brom equalise, 2-2. West Brom take the lead, 3-2. And of course, and eventually they do. That's the score by which they win. But of course, they were coming then. Hard upon this previous season, 53, when Bolton were 3-1 up against Blackpool with 10 minutes to go, and they were pulled back. So one of the things I think, one of the great appeals of the FA Cup final in these years, is the fact that it doesn't really, going 1-0 down is certainly no death sentence. You can certainly come back.
Yeah, that's right. I think I do think this is the era, and maybe those come back to part of the reason why the FA Cup became so established as just such an occasion. I think it's difficult, perhaps, watching modern football to quite appreciate how big an occasion it was. I think there's so many factors involved in it, apart from the games themselves. How rarely a live game was on television, for instance.
Yes.
I think that's got to be one of the major factors.
Oh, yeah.
And also that it's only during the period that we're looking at that, for example, European football started.
Yes.
And so the cup was exactly that. It was the cup. It didn't need to be called the FA Cup. It was the knockout competition.
Yeah.
And I'd say that even at the end of the period we're looking at, it was still the most prestigious prize, certainly in domestic football. I'm not quite sure when the league overtook it, but maybe that was sometime in the mid to late 70s at the earliest.
Well, indeed, at the early, it may well have been when with the Premier League. I mean, the Premier League has seen the FA Cup was salvageable even into the Premier League period. If you've got 4 places in European Cup Champions League, if you give all 4 to the top 4 in the league, then obviously there are no other ways into the competition apart unless you're actually going to win it, as Chelsea did in 2012. They could quite easily have given 3 to the top 3 in the league and 1 to the winners of the FA Cup. One thing that strikes me is that this was clearly the most prestigious cup competition in the world and the most prestigious domestic cup competition in the world. I just wonder how much of an effect it has. So these teams are playing in quite high-profile matches in cup ties, which were much more significant, I think, than elsewhere on the continent or perhaps in Latin America. I just wonder how much it helped them. Whether they learned from, because actually, certainly in the 60s, English teams began to dominate in Europe as well. Like the Cup Winners' Cup was won in '63 by Tottenham, '64 by West Ham, later in that decade by Manchester City and Chelsea. And you wonder whether this was actually something that struck me was okay. How many of the players who played in the 1966 World Cup final had played in FA Cup finals and had that experience? Actually, it's not that many. It's only about 5, of the boys of '66 who've got experience of playing in the FA Cup. So it's odd, really, in some ways, because you would have thought that playing in such high-profile matches would have given players a bit, sort of an edge, really, or our players an edge in tournaments against teams from the continent and beyond.
So I'd never thought of it in those terms, helping them play big international matches, the experience specifically the FA Cup. But I think there's something in that. It maybe did, because even players who'd only played in semi-finals, they were still the biggest games they'd played that season. And yes, why it would help them deal with the big occasion. I think it would have to do.
I think it probably does become more of a factor in the 70s and 80s when English teams dominate in Europe in cup competition. But bear in mind, the European Cup in these years is a straight old knockout tournament. It's a draw, and if you get unlucky, like Nottingham Forest did in picking Liverpool, and Liverpool in picking Nottingham Forest in the first round of the tournament, they're used to all that from playing in the FA Cup. So I don't know. It's just an idle thought. One of the things that struck me looking at these games in a more granular level was the extent to which, well, 2 things really. One was that in general, most of these teams who reach the final, who win the top tournament, have not had that successful a league season. I mean, it is surprising, really, when you've got 25 years here, that at only one of these teams, or 17 different teams I know who've won the FA Cup in these years, only one of these teams has actually won the league as well. You might think that was quite surprising that, there weren't more, perhaps there weren't, more of the sort of really prominent league performers playing in these finals. That was one thing. I mean, that is quite common as well. For example, you take '59 when you got Notts Forest against Luton, Nottingham Forest against Luton, I think Nottingham Forest finished something like 13th and Luton something like 18th in that season.
Yes.
So I think it's probably right to say that, well, first of all, guaranteeing success in the league doesn't guarantee you success in the cup. And secondly, that perhaps one of the appeals of the cup was the fact that it was possible to have a bit of a dodgy old season and yet still to rescue it with a cup. I think this is right, isn't it? With a cup run later in the season, later in the second half of the season. And
Definitely.
yeah, go on.
And maybe getting as far as the 5th or 6th round would mean that if you're not actually in the running to win the league, why would the league games matter so very much to you? I mean, unless you were fighting against relegation, they probably wouldn't. The cup would so much become the priority, which is an interesting contrast to now, when teams would still prioritise the league, and that business of where teams finished in the league did surprise me quite often.
Yeah, I agree.
The one that really surprised me was Manchester City in 1969.
Yeah, who finished right down the league, don't they?
Yeah, they finished 13th that season,
That's
which
right,
I found astonishing. It was such a strong side, and they were huge favourites going into that game.
And they won the league the year before.
And they'd won the league. They won the league the year
13th
before
as league champion. I mean, that is remarkable.
Yes, and they were still recognised as being a fantastic side.
Well, they were indeed.
It was that side that year when Tony Buck was Footballer of the Year.
Yeah.
They won the Cup Winners' Cup the following season. Everybody recognised them as being a fantastic side, and yet they only finished 13th. And presumably that had to be because they were prioritising the cup.
Yeah, I think that must be right. Although, in saying that, it's actually striking how often teams do well in the cup, who having done pretty lousily in the league. I've got a few here. Charlton finished 19th in 1947. They won in 1947. They finished 19th in the league. Bolton in 1958 finished 15th. West Ham in 1960. So these are cup winners. Won the cup.
Yes.
Finished 14th in the league. Everton 1966 finished 11th with a team full of stars. Man City, Man City, you said, is 69, finished 30th. So all 6 won the cup. The league form apparently no obstacle to success so it seems to me that one of the reasons why the cup may have been popular was because A, because you may not have been doing too well in the league, and B, because it gave you a sort of chance where there hadn't been one before. And actually, another way of looking at that is that I looked at in doing some research on this, at the relative positions of the 2 finalists in the cup itself, and how they had. And in fact, it's interesting that league form is really no guide to success in the cup. For example, in 1963, Leicester finished 4th in the league, and Manchester finished 18th. So if you took league form as a guide, it's quite obvious that Leicester are the superior side. They've basically finished in what we now call the Champions League places, and Manchester United finished in what we now call the relegation places. But Man United, as you know, won 3-1. And that's not that uncommon. In fact, I did a calculation where I reckon out of, there were 3 of the teams that reached the final are from the second division, and all 3 lose. But so we take the other 22 games, which are all first division titles, games between 2 first division teams. And in every one of those, it's really a bit unpredictable. I think it's 12 times the team who finishes higher in the league wins the cup, 10 times the team who finishes lower in the league wins the cup. So it's remarkable how little league form has impact on what goes on in the cup.
That's very striking, and I think the most likely explanation is just simply that the cup was so big that very good sides were prioritising that competition, and so that's why you could ignore league form to such a degree. And whether as well there was the thing of the idea, it seems incredible now, of people wondering whether it was even possible to do the double. It was seen as such an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. So
Yeah.
whether that had some effect, because as you said, Peter, there was only in that era there was only the one side who did manage it, and no team before Spurs in 61, of course, had managed to do it in the 20th century.
That's
You had
right.
to go back to Victorian times for it to have been achieved.
That's
And
right.
so there are sides in this period who came close to doing it, either because they won the cup and went very close to winning the league. So that, for example, Wolves was the case, wasn't it, in 1960, or the other way round.
Yes.
Manchester United winning the league in 57, but
Yes.
losing the cup final that year.
Mm. Yes, they're both arranged. And West Brom had something similar, didn't they? They think they
yes,
just missed out on the league in 54 and then but won the cup. And I think, if you bear in mind that to win the cup, you've got to win 6 games out of 6. Then you can see why, if you're already top of the league, you can see why playing another 6 games and winning every one of them is quite a challenge. And it was very competitive. I think teams really saw, especially teams from lower divisions, really saw they had a chance here of some glory. And in those circumstances, then you could see why first division teams often did come a cropper. And of course, these are very celebrated moments. The other thing that struck me about this, so looking at it, was undoubtedly a sort of national occasion. The Prince Philip turned up to meet the players. The Queen was there to present the trophy. The Grenadier Guards were marching around at lunch at half time. There was even a cup final hymn of all things. What on earth the cup final needed a hymn for? A very nice hymn. Don't get me wrong, but it's a very odd thing to have. A sort of hymn, particularly quite so pious as Abide With Me. But it was a real application. I get the impression that basically the streets were deserted and everybody was in their living rooms with half the neighbourhood cheering on one side or another on these occasions. But I think one of the reasons why the cup built up a sort of reputation for excitement and thrills was because of the number of individual narratives which it threw up. And so you've mentioned already Bert Troutman, who broke his neck in 1956, and we're going to come on to this quite soon in our discussion. And something like 17 minutes from the end, and still Manchester City managed to hold on to their lead and see themselves through. But there were lots of other great individual stories. I wonder what were your favourite individual stories from these games, leaving Troutman aside. Which other individual narratives?
Well, there's a Stanley Matthews story of him being such a huge figure in the game and not winning the cup for so long.
That was absolutely a national story.
And then winning it in 1953. And of course, he went on, we know now, to play for many years after that. But presumably at the time, people thought of him as being at the end of his career. Absolutely. Because he was, I think, 38.
Yes, 38.
When Blackpool did win it in 53.
He was still playing for England several years later.
He was, yes. But maybe, I guess at the time, people thought of it as being his last chance. And to win it in such a dramatic game, having lost before, that's got to be one of the big
sort of individual dramatic moments or dramatic achievements and narratives of the period. Yes, yes. You go on.
And another one is, to say, a poignant, and sad one is Manchester United being in the finals in 57 and 58.
Yes.
And 6 of the players who played in the 57 final were dead before the 58 final, and two others besides.
Yes.
And they got to the final in 58 was absolutely remarkable. And of course, it didn't quite end in the fairy tale story of them winning it in 58, but it was still a remarkable thing to get to that second final.
Most definitely. I've got here a list of 10 FA Cup heroes, as I'm calling them, which I agree with you. Stan Matthews undoubtedly in 53 and Bert Troutman in 56. I got to add to that Mike Treblecock, if that's how we pronounce it.
I think it is.
In '66, he wasn't. That's not how Kenneth Wolstenholme pronounced it on the BBC in back in the 1960s.
I think I trust you more than than him, Peter.
Well, I think there was a certain sort of blushing behind the flushing and clutching of pearls in those days with when a name like Treblecock came up. But that's what he. But Treblecock's brilliant. I mean, so if I tell you, if I give you a name, you tell me a year. So Mike Treblecock.
Yes, that was 66.
How about Don Revie? Well, you mentioned Don Revie.
Yeah, in 56, yes.
I've got a real Sam Mortensen.
Of course, scoring the hat trick in 53, and yet it still being the Matthews final.
Jolly good. Jeff Astle.
Yeah, Astle was 68.
I think he scored in every round, didn't he? That's why I've included him.
Yes, that's right, he did.
Just waiting to could he score in the final, and he could, and he won the tournament. And then others that we sort of famous names from this period. Ernie Taylor, I think, is an interesting character from the FA Cup in the 50s. Of course, he won his one England cap in the game against Hungary in 53. But he had he played for 3 different teams in the FA Cup final. 2 golds, 1 silver, I reckon. Ernie Taylor, 51 for Newcastle, 53 for Blackpool, 58 for Manchester United.
Yes.
Don Revie, you mentioned, 56. Don Revie has an interesting non-appearance. Do you know this one? He's in 1949. He's Leicester City's best player, but he's injured for the final. Actually, he's nearly dies of a hemorrhage. He can't stop bleeding. His nose is bleeding.
I'd forgotten that detail.
But he's the best player. He's the real missing link. Leicester, I think, in 49 are a second division team. I think that's right.
Well, they weren't only a second division side. They were really remarkable because they only just escaped relegation from the second division.
They did, you're right.
And their semi-final was really remarkable in that year because they knocked out Portsmouth, who won the league title that year.
Yeah, that's right enough. Yeah.
So that they won. They beat Portsmouth 3-1, and that was it's going to be one of the great upsets.
Undoubtedly. I got one more for you, Bert Turner. I don't think you know this one. You might know it, Bert Turner.
No, Bert Turner. No, you've got me that with that.
He plays in the first FA Cup final after the war, 1946. He scores for both teams.
That's right.
First, you better remember, just Bert.
Yeah.
Because it's after 85 minutes. I mean, people must have been so keen and happy to see the FA Cup final, return in 46 after a gap of whatever it was, 7 years. And he scored 85 minutes. It's 0-0. He scores an own goal. He plays for he's a Charlton fullback. Scores an own goal in the 85th minute and scores for Charlton in the 86th from a free kick. It's a deflected goal, but it's given to him. But I think he's probably the only one. Is he the only one? Oh no, there are others who scored for both sides. Hutchinson for Coventry.
Hutchinson did it in 81 for playing for City. And Gary Mabbott did it, didn't he?
I did. Obviously, I've shut that out. Now we can't talk about the FA Cup final without referring to the Wembley hoodoo. And because so many of these games, in fact, I think it's 8 in about 14 years, are damaged by, let's say, seriously affected by serious injuries at a time when it's almost impossible to understand it now or believe it now that substitutes are not permitted. And so the absurd situation arises where you've got this hugely successful symbol of the FA, of England, of English football, of English national life being damaged really by the fact that players were getting injured and were being forced to continue to play, even though they should have been on their way to hospital. Examples like the one we mentioned already, Ray Wood with his broken cheekbone for Manchester United in 1957 and concussion, I suspect. That really assaulted almost. I mean, it was legal. It was within the rules at that time. In the 6th minute, and goalkeeper, and therefore in the sort of line of fire, if you like. So what happens there is that Manchester United have to put somebody else in goal. Ray Wood can't continue in goal. He'll go and stand on the left wing and do his best out there. Who takes over from Wood?
It was Jackie Blanchflower, I think,
Absolutely.
who went in goal, and they ended up, because United were 2 down, but because United scored to make it 2-1, they took the risk of putting Wood back in goal.
Right. Did they? Oh,
I
that's
think
interesting.
they figured they got a chance to get the equaliser and take the
Well, of course,
risk.
because it's a double punishment.
Paul Wood was vulnerable again, not only on the pitch, but I mean, fortunately, it didn't happen. But putting himself in a position where he could have been more seriously injured. You're right. The risks that were taken were incredible.
The story's gone. One of the things that strikes me about, let's just have a quick look at something. So 1952, Wally Barnes does his knee, playing for Arsenal.
Yes.
Arsenal lose, of course. 1953, Eric Bell playing for Bolton does his hamstring. Bolton lose, of course. They don't all lose, mind you. This is interesting.
No, that's right.
Wood's broken cheekbone, 57. United lose.
Well, one of the very strange ones, and I do wonder whether this played a part in almost, this idea that there was a curse, was the one in 55 in 1955.
Oh, I don't know about
when Jimmy Meadows went off.
Right.
And he was a right back, and he did seem to be quite often right backs.
Before?
And he suffered a leg injury when he had been attempting to tackle Mitchell of Newcastle.
Ah.
But what was strange about that was one that you've just mentioned, which is maybe the start of the curse, 1952, when the Arsenal right back, Karl Barnes, also had attempted to tackle Mitchell, the Newcastle winger.
Good Lord.
And in the same part of the pitch.
Wow.
So whether that strange coincidence contributed to the idea of the curse, I don't know.
It's interesting. Frank McClintock's autobiography, which I've been reading recently, played for Leicester, of course, in 61 and 63. He reckons it was the heavy pitch that you got at Wembley. So players had been used to April, May. They'd be used to playing on basically sort of hardened mud for their clubs, and then they suddenly turn up and they're on this plush carpet. But I don't know how credible that is. Just going on 59. Dwight breaks his leg for Nottingham Forest. Nottingham Forest win, of course. 1960, Whelan breaks his leg for Blackburn. Dave Whelan, famously. Yeah. 1961, Chalmers damages his leg, 20th minute, Leicester lose, of course. So it's interesting how many injuries to legs we're getting here as well, and to muscular injuries. We have a kind that you probably wouldn't expect of professional sportsmen on a flat pitch. You wouldn't think perhaps so many leg injuries and so many muscular injuries.
I mean, I think it does seem to be that from 52 onwards, up until the late 60s, it seemed to be more often than not that there would be a very serious injury.
Yeah, and which would have an effect on the result.
Yeah. Like I said, not always did it mean that the side lost. That the 55 that I mentioned, Newcastle still won. Jerry Burns for Liverpool broke his collarbone quite early in 65.
5 minutes, the most extraordinary of all of them.
Still, they still won.
That's that game that goes to extra time. He plays for 2 hours basically with a broken collarbone.
That's right.
It's just extraordinary.
Yeah.
So what makes me think? Sorry, yes, go on, Karl.
No. I was just sort of making a point again, just how often injuries influence a game, but not necessarily.
Oh, yeah.
A defeat. So in 59, it sounds as though Luton were coming back at first. At Forest with a better side, but they went down to 9 men, and Luton were absolutely they down to 9 men in effect, because they were carrying an injured player as well as Dwight who'd gone off injured, and they were battering for us. And if they'd managed to take it to extra time, you've got to think would have been very likely to win. But Luton held on.
It's extraordinary that it takes so long for the FA to wake up to the fact that substitutes are an option here, because substitutes have been around for a long time, been around since at least the early 50s. And so they're not a completely foreign concept. But the FA were quite happy, it seems, or at least were tolerating their showpiece final being disrupted year after year by injuries. Were quite unnecessary to have people limping around on the left wing when they should be in the treatment room. And it's not until 1967 that substitutes are first. So we're the first substitutes to appear on the team sheet. Jones for Tottenham and Kirkup for Chelsea. And I don't know if either is used in that game, but
they weren't.
They didn't come off the bench. So there was even that. Well, I think there was probably a sense of we don't actually know how to use it. If we don't get injuries, we're not going to use tactical substitutes. And of course, that is said of Alf Ramsey in 1970, was that he didn't really know how to use substitutes, and the consequences we know. But that just remind me that if in 1966, now moving from the FA Cup final to the World Cup final, because in fact, it's interesting. There's only one player who plays in the World Cup final who had played in that season's FA Cup final. I expect you know who that was.
Yeah, Wilson.
Wilson. He had a good summer. Although I don't suppose he was particularly elated about it. He was never elated about anything very much. But anyway, if in 1966 the World Cup final had been as damaged as some of these FA Cup finals had been by an injury, then you can't help feeling that the FA and perhaps FIFA too would have felt rather idiotic. I mean, fortunately, I reckon that in all those games at Wembley, 6 games at Wembley, well, I'll first of all put this point. I don't think it was that great an advantage to have all those games at Wembley when you look at the carnage which these FA Cup finals have produced. And I think over those 6 games, only one injury to an English player. I think that's right. No muscular injuries, perhaps because England was super fit. I don't know. Only one injury. Do you want to? Any ideas?
Oh, now that's a good. So
it wasn't, and it's not a muscular injury. So 6 games that England play in 66. You might expect, on the basis of what we got here, to see at least a couple getting muscular injuries and being invalidated out. Well, it didn't happen. There was only one injury, I think, to the England squad or the England team in those years.
Well, there was Greaves.
Well, that's the one. That's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one. But not a muscular injury, of course. It was just he basically, I think, he got a really serious cut leg. But I think if the World Cup final in '66 had been as affected by injury as these games, then substitutes would have been.
It's a very interesting question as to why, right? So why the FA didn't use them, and of course now we absolutely take it for granted that you have substitutes, and I think it's fair to say the vast majority of substitutions that happen in modern football are tactical rather than because of injuries. And it's totally, managers go into games expecting to put on player X or player Y after 65 or 70 minutes. It's absolutely part of their tactics.
Totally.
But I think, strange as it seems to us now, a tactical substitution would have been seen as being somewhat unsporting if you'd had substitutions. And also, I suspect the main reason that they didn't allow them was because you're supposed to be able to play 90 minutes. It's part of the game that you can play 90 or even 120 if it goes to extra time. And that therefore, going into the game, if I'm the manager of the side and you're one of my players, and I don't think you can manage to play more than 70 minutes because you're carrying a knock, but you're one of my best players, well, I shouldn't really pick you.
No, indeed. No, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Well,
and having the option of a substitute allows me to, in inverted commas, cheat by including you in my side when you're not up to playing 90 minutes.
I wonder. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying, and it's obviously a strange concept to somebody following the modern game, but I think that was the idea. And I do remember once reading a book, presumably ghostwritten, but pretending to be by Matt Busby, and presumably included Busby's real opinions. And his idea to get round this problem, and I think the book was published in 1957, was to allow substitutions, but in order to avoid a tactical substitution, to leave a gap between the player going off and the substitute coming on. So I can't remember what time period he suggested, but you'd say if you brought off a player after 30 minutes, you could only put on the substitute after 40. And that compromise, as an idea, was to prevent tactical substitutions, because you wouldn't deliberately want to be down to 10 men for 10 minutes.
And yet it's good. That's a very good idea, a good way around it. Yet the curious thing is that we now take a lot of interest in tactical substitutions, and we know which managers are very good at tactical substitutions. So something like Jose Mourinho uses tactical substitutions both to make a point to his own players, but also to change the shape of the game. Certainly managers like Mourinho pride themselves on their ability to change the shape of the game as it proceeds, but also to send a message to their own supporters. So, for example, when Mourinho, as managers nowadays do quite from time to time, makes like 3 changes at once at half time, that kind of thing, it's quite clear saying to the supporters, that I wasn't happy with that performance either, and nor were you. Well, now, Karl, that's been a really fascinating talk through these 25 years of the FA Cup. It's a tragedy it wasn't protected by the FA. It's a tragedy it's not the same as it always was. It's, in a way, it's impossible for it to have been, because the Cup was clear, as we said, was such a unique occasion. But I think we've covered lots of the reasons which made it unique, including the individual stories, the narratives, the drama, the excitement, the heroes, and so hopefully we've basically covered the field. So thanks again to Karl, and see you next time.